The following is intended only for mature audiences.
Open your ears and lube up your butthole. It's time for the What Do We Call It podcast. Now, here's your host. It's Jmann. Welcome to the What Do We Call It podcast. I'm Jmann, and it's the holiday season now. Or it was. I guess it's over. So I've been sitting on my ass for weeks trying to get together some ideas for show episodes. And unfortunately, everything I wanted to talk about kept evolving. So let's just right from the jump get into this. Minnesota is a fucking embarrassment in terms of the way it manages all of its entitlement programs. And if you haven't heard, and you'd have to be retarded, in a coma, or living under a rock to not know this, but there's been a substantial amount of fraud in this state in the last few years, we've found out. And let's talk about that today.
Oh, you didn't know?
So a little while back, there was the Feeding Our Future scandal, and that was people that were running alleged kitchens to provide free meals to youth that were at risk of suffering food insufficiency. So apparently there were a bunch of people in the Somali community, if you pay attention to the defendants, of which it's like 95% people of Somali descent. And because Minnesota has the largest Somali population in America, I guess we were the epicenter for all of this shit. And it really kicked off right when COVID did. During the pandemic, the state shut down, kids went to distance learning. They weren't in the facilities every day at their elementary, middle, and high schools or learning centers to be receiving the meals that they normally would that were paid for with tax dollars. So now these businesses would then open up these alleged spots for them to get those meals so they wouldn't have to worry about not having something to eat while they're at home doing the distance learning. They said they were giving out all these meals, and nobody did any checks and balances to make sure that these meals were actually being served to legitimate children. And the number of meals being served that these places were being federally subsidized and state subsidized was astronomical. And it didn't throw off anybody's alarms at all, no red flags, no nothing, until suddenly, oh my God, we spent how much on food? And then they start looking into it, and then bing, bang, boom, they find out that there's tens of millions of dollars in fraud involved in this. And part of why this is so bothersome is because that was money that comes from the collective tax pool in our state to go to help the less fortunate. And what it really went to do was to buy the people that put together these little schemes of registering just fake names. And nobody knows the difference because there's like 100,000 of those fucking people here in this state, thanks in part to how our government imported them in the 90s as refugees of war due to what was going on in Somalia itself. And, 30-some years later, it's biting us in the ass. These people get caught. They use the money that was supposed to actually feed legitimate children to buy jewelry and fancy cars and take vacations and homes, and then funnel some money back home to their family members in Somalia. And I'll get back to more of that later, because that's a big fucking how to do in this punch bowl of fiscal diarrhea. So the Feeding Our Future, that was the first fraud they picked up. Then there was the Housing Stabilization Services scandal that broke recently here a few months ago. And what they found out is that anybody that wanted to start a housing stabilization services, and you've got someone coming from out of country to come here as a refugee, or somebody that came here as a refugee and they're having a hard time finding a place to live, so you help them secure housing. And a bunch of businesses cropped up, and oddly enough, there's like one building, I think in St. Louis Park or Hopkins, that had a dozen of these fucking alleged businesses housed there. But an investigative reporter went there, and all it was a bunch of doors with a plaque for a business name on a door, and there was never anybody there. And they tried to reach these people, and they couldn't. So it looked like it was all just a sham, each and every one of them. And the people that own these businesses now are being accused of laundering those funds they received fraudulently to fuel their own lifestyles. And this was made even easier for all these businesses to crop up because getting a license to do so was made easier by our Democrat-led state government, where they were just not taking the appropriate steps to vet these people out. So then everybody and their mom was in on this, and they told all their friends and cousins, hey, you could do this too. So then it just ballooned up and became a problem that just turned into a pandemic of itself. And at one time, late 22 into 23, our state had like a $19 billion budget surplus forecasted. And from all this mismanagement in the last 2.5 years now, it's been whittled down to just a couple of billion. And they're trying to sit here and figure out where all that money went to cover their asses. And nobody was stabilizing any housing for anybody. And that's another way they were stealing money. And I wish that was everything there was to say about fraud in the Somali community in the state of Minnesota. But unfortunately, in the last 2 weeks, more shit has been coming out because conservative YouTuber Nick Shirley did some investigative reporting into alleged fraudulent daycare centers that are going on in the Twin Cities. And he and another guy that had been looking into where the funding is going for this made this long-ass video that's had millions of views now. And there's dozens upon dozens of licensed daycare centers in the state of Minnesota that are being run by Somalis. Some of them have multiple businesses at the same address, and nobody caught this shit. They're licensed for dozens to 100 kids, and they're receiving millions of dollars in aid from the state Medicaid program to help fund these daycare centers and offset their costs. But they went to these places, and there were no kids there. And some of them had locked doors. And one of them had a sign that was supposed to say Learning Center, Quality Learning Center. It said Quality Leering Center. And he just kept exposing site after site. When you get there, people would answer the door, but they wouldn't talk to him. Or they'd give him minimal answers and try to send him away because they knew that they were ripping off the state and they were about to get caught. And that wasn't all they uncovered, because they talked to the guy who had been looking into the state funding and where it was going. And he starts talking about transportation services. And what do daycare centers need? They need someone to drive these kids to the daycare centers. And all the drivers are apparently also Somali. So you have to assume that these transportation services are also not on the up and up. And it's just part of another layer to the onion here, where they're getting more state aid money to line their own pockets. And this has been going on. Well, the heat has been on the Feeding Our Future scandal and all the Housing Stabilization Service scandal. And the funding is still going to these fucking alleged daycare centers. And it wasn't the state attorney general that uncovered this. No, it wasn't Keith Ellison. It was a YouTuber. And holy shit, am I thankful that he did expose this, because now the attention is on it. The government's been digging into it. Big time. And that's mainly because the news broke and the taxpayers are pissed off. And the citizens are like, hey, during these last few years of you working from home and apparently having your head in your ass, all this happened. And now you need to atone for it by figuring out where the money went and holding those people that partook in these crimes accountable. To the point where the Department of Justice is now getting involved and the FBI is involved, and every arm of Trump's government is trying to look into this like it's our enemy on our home soil. They're putting all the focus on the Somali community in Minnesota and our blithering idiot of a governor. Our lovely, ever so eloquent president referred to our governor as someone who is, quote, severely retarded. Under normal circumstances, I'd be like, come on, Donald, that's a bit harsh. But if you know Tim Walz, we call him Tampon Timmy, and No Balls Walls. He's a fucking idiot, and maybe he ran on those aw shucks small town casserole recipe swapping sweater vest dad jokes kind of persona when he was trying to be VP to Kamala Harris. But I'm telling you, the guy's a fucking nutless liberal progressive, and at this point, so much fraud has gone unchecked and undetected that people are like, is he getting kickbacks? Is he in on this? It happened on his watch. What the fuck? And real quick, he said, you know what? You're asking me if I'm responsible for this because it happened while I was in office. I'm telling you, I'm the one that's going to hold them responsible and get the arrests. I'm the one that helped push for the Feeding Our Future prosecutions and such. I'm like, yeah, it's a little bit of fucking sleight of hand there, Timmy. You don't want to focus on all the other shit that DHS didn't catch, and all these people during the pandemic were just sitting at home, remote work, thumbs in their asses, fucking looking at their TikTok feeds and watching Netflix instead of doing their fucking jobs. So now he's become a laughingstock in the ire of the state, and he deserves it, honestly, because after the way he bent over and fucking took an unlubed dick over the whole George Floyd riots in Minneapolis and not sending out the National Guard fast enough. I am by no means trying to sound like a conservative or a right-winger, but the Democrats that run our fucking state here in Minnesota are loopy dipshits that pander to small segments of the population for moral high ground and to get votes and support. I get why, because our two-party system's about who's in power, but it should be more about who's helping the people and who has the best ideas. Unfortunately, that's not how American politics work.
That is correct.
So anyways, now Walz is trying to clean it up. He's trying to deflect blame. And I got to say that, honestly, everybody whose job it was to be in charge of watching over this needs to be held to account, either fired or possibly charged with criminal negligence for letting so much widespread fraudulent financial abuse of our state's entitlement and assistance program system. And there's all these people that are not getting the money that they needed. And the last prong of this, I saved it for last because it's near and dear to my heart, because my sister was disabled and because I worked with differently abled adults and vulnerable adults when I was a social worker. In the Somali community, there's a high rate of autism. In fact, if you do some digging, you'll find out it is legitimately 4 times higher than the rest of the population. Why? Well, there's some science involved. If you know people from Somalia, you know that it's all about your tribe. You try to marry in your tribe to maintain the purity of the tribal blood. So there's a lot of interfamilial marriages and inbreeding, technically. When there's not enough differentiation in the DNA and you're making new human beings, you're going to get some ones that should have been sent back to the factory because they were duds. There's no quality control in genetics, unfortunately. You can't stop this shit from happening. So because these cousin fuckers keep marrying their own kin, they keep reproducing offspring that are more and more likely to have some sort of cognitive impairment because of the lack of differentiation in their DNA. Think of it like the difference between the water that comes out of the tap at your home that's filtered and treated and the water that's like in a swamp and a pond that's all murky and muddy. So there are legitimately disabled people due to this in-tribal breeding. But I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about the individuals now that are taking kids that are right there on the cusp of having a disability and taking them to a doctor that gives a fraudulent diagnosis so they can get all of that sweet, sweet Department of Human Services aid money. So as somebody that advocates for the disabled, the truly disabled, when I think about all these Somali kids that have, quote, autism, do they or they just have low IQs? Because if we don't have the checks and balances to stop them from ripping off food services during the pandemic, and we haven't stopped them from setting up fake housing stabilization services, who's to say they're not lying about the autism rate? Guess what? That's where the fucking focus is now. Where was the money from the DHS going? To people that deserved it or to more fraud schemes? And you got Trump piling on and calling Somalis in Minnesota garbage people. And you got Ilhan Omar, who's a state legislator, who's Somali, who's calling everybody racist for putting the microscope over her community. So left-wing bleeding hearts are like, hey, stop it, knock it off. And there's all this support for the Somali community coming from fucking limp-wristed baby dick Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, who held a press conference to say he supports the Somali community. Don't pick on all of them. And there's actors making comments about supporting Somalis. The city of Edina, Minnesota, just released a statement saying they support their Somali citizens because they culturally enrich the city itself. But honestly, that just seems like more political pandering to a community that is reeling from some much deserved scrutiny over all the crimes they've committed. While I'm not trying to say that all Somalis are bad and we should hate them, because you should never blanket hate any one group. But unfortunately for the good ones, there are seemingly far more that are involved in all these fraud schemes and all this bullshit to bleed the Minnesota state tax coffers dry and then utilize all this aid money that should be going to the deserving people who it is earmarked for, and they're using it for their own selfish gain. You look at all of this and you're like, how could it possibly go any worse than this? But wait, there's more.
You got to be kidding me.
There are now apparently allegations being made that money being stolen from the state of Minnesota is being used to fund terrorism overseas. And there's questions about whether or not some of the money that's being received from these fraud schemes and entitlement program payouts and Medicaid is finding its way into the pockets of Al-Shabaab, a terrorist group that operates in Somalia. And Republicans were pushing this narrative, and the Democrats were like, nah, that's bullshit. But unfortunately, it appears to be true. And I'll explain it in a way that makes sense and is completely nonpartisan in tone. People come here from other countries, whether it's from anywhere in Africa or Europe or anywhere over there in Asia, and they have family members back home, and they will send money back home. It's not something that is exclusive to the Minnesota Somali population. So do not damn them for that. They're trying to look out for their own tribal mentality, take care of family. Good on them. I'd do it too if I was in that position. But I'd probably do it with money that I had earned on the up and up instead of, fraudulently ripping off the state and its taxpayers. But I digress. Unfortunately, because Somalia has still been a fucking cesspool of fraud and questionable violence and poor governance since the 90s when they all came here, you've got a UN-backed government that is basically still at war with Al-Shabaab, a terrorist group, who are going around like the mob and extorting people. And people get money sent to them from family members in America back in Somalia. And they know those checks are coming. And they find out who the hell's getting the money. And it has been reported that they strong-arm the citizens and business owners of Somalia for those funds so they can use them to buy guns and implements of war. So, in an indirect way, Minnesota Somalis who send money back home are funding terrorism.
Holy shit!
You could say they're funding terrorism, but you're leaving out the context, and that's a very important factor, is that it is not through the fault of their own. I'm sure maybe there's a few of them that are sending it back home like, hey, by the way, here comes the money. Come fucking get it. Most of them, I have to believe, are just trying to support family members back home because there's still abject poverty all over the place in Somalia and various parts of Africa. But these terrorists, they find out about this, they take the money, they buy the guns, they fight the war against the UN-backed government because Al-Shabaab wants to fucking take over Somalia and run it their way. So isn't that nice? Have I hit all the various points that I wanted to? I wrote some notes to myself, but I really wanted to fucking just go with this brain stew that I've had going on for weeks. And every time I went to sit down to fucking write a few notes to myself to record, it's like, oh shit, more stuff? Oh shit, more stuff? Oh fuck, more stuff? And it just kept piling on and on and on, and my eyes were rolling in my head like, holy fuck, are you serious? And then, of course, there had to be one last facet of this I'm going to throw at you because I think it's going to keep going. There was a presidential cabinet meeting that I saw that was on TV and YouTube where Kristi Noem, the weird, frozen, melty-faced, dog-shooting Secretary of Homeland Security, claimed that she started looking into visas issued in Minnesota to immigrants and that 50% of them were fraudulent. And I just said to myself, there's no fucking way. Half? That's your claim? This is an administration that's known for hyperbole and just lying its ass off with reckless abandon and acting like they're not doing anything wrong or full of shit when they are. So I called Steiny, my co-host, and I'm like, hey, let me run this by you. And I told him, I'm like, does that seem feasible to you? Like, just look at the mathematical probability that half of the people that are seeking visas to be in Minnesota are fraudulent and illegal, and they are erroneously issued visas. 50%, he's like, that sounds like bullshit to me, but does it surprise you with the Trump administration? I'm like, no, but that's why there's all this ICE attention in Minnesota now, and you've got all these people around here like, here's the number to call if you spot anything going on to tell ICE where to go. Make sure you send them to someplace where they have no business being so they waste their time. And it's like, are you out of your fucking mind? We're trying to clean up this mess. We're not trying to make it more difficult for federal agents to come in here and catch criminals. Like, let them legitimately do their job. I get that ICE is being used in a way that is just mind-bogglingly overbearing, but there is some value to what they're doing. So to review, Tim Walz, fucking idiot. Minnesota, too giving. Somali people in the state of Minnesota have repeatedly defrauded the system that takes taxpayer dollars for their own benefit and then indirectly fund terrorism back home in Somalia. And then starving people, homeless people, and disabled people are getting fucked in the process. Hope that helps you feel like you're informed. Do not vote for Tim Walz. Let's hope that we get somebody who's center-left and less of a progressive and isn't worried about kids chopping off their ding-dong so they can feel good about themselves rather than, think of the long-term consequences, or putting tampons in boys' bathrooms. Interact with the show on Twitter, @WhatDoWeCallIt. That is @WhatDoWeCallIt. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/group/WhatDoWeCallIt podcast show. For the What Do We Call It podcast, I'm Jmann. And that's the end.